Okay, thank you. So, yeah, I'm here today to talk about the documentation, and like Jarno, I did a little sort of unintentional bait and switch with you. There is a title in the agenda that is not the title on this slide, and that was just a little glitch that happened. I will be talking more about exactly how we build the documentation in a longer session tomorrow at the DITA Europe conference. We realized that talking about that process in detail would probably sort of exceed the boundaries of a 10-minute lightning talk. So for those of you who are interested in more about the process, I'll talk about that some more tomorrow, but I will touch on it now. So what I'd like to do for the next few minutes is just give you an update on the things that we have changed since last year. For those of you who were here last year and have curious to see what's happened since, I want to give you a little bit of a progress report, and then we'll get to George's changes. Here we go. So what are we going to talk about? We'll talk a little bit about changes to the website, about things that have happened in the 2.3 release, which happened after DITA-OT Day last year, and then some new things in 2.4. Talk about where we stand with the things that I promised last year, and what we plan to do next. So, okay, what's new? The website. We talked about that this morning. That's perhaps the most visible change. There have been a few things under the hood, though, beyond the landing page changes, and perhaps those have gone unnoticed, so I just want to bring your attention to those. We talked a little bit about the fact that we have a continuous integration process in place now to actually build the documentation each time we change something in the source code. So we'll see that in action in a moment, but that's something that we had talked about doing for a long time, and over the past year, with Jarno's help, actually made that happen. And what George mentioned earlier is this edit this page functionality, and we'll look at that on the documentation end, what happens after someone submits a pull request like that. And something a little just nice to have thing that maybe never got announced or talked about much is the fact that we have some keyboard shortcuts on the documentation now, where you can quickly find a topic just by pressing the letter T and starting to type some letters, and you'll find all of the topics whose titles include the letters that you've typed. So for those of you that use the documentation online as your sort of way to access the toolkit documentation, that's a quick way to get what you're looking for without navigating around in your mouse. There's also an S shortcut that will take you to the search box, which just goes and does a full text search of the topics. So that's something that we implemented at some point, I think in January maybe, and never properly announced. So there you go, announced. What have we changed in 2.3? The user guide has a few new topics there about using the DITA command, and some of the ways that the DITA command supports generating output that may not be so familiar to people. So we can use properties files now to store the parameters that we want to pass to our builds. Typically in the past, before the DITA command arrived, people were doing this in Ant scripts, and their Ant scripts contained the properties, or the parameters settings and things like that. Now we can do that in a properties file that basically serves the purpose that many people used Ant build scripts for in the past. If you were using them just to store properties, you don't need to do that anymore. And so there's some instructions on how to do that and how to migrate your old Ant build scripts to use this new method. And this content was provided by our colleague Shane Taylor. Hey, it works better if I put that in front of my mouth. Sorry about that. It's slipping over my ear. So our colleague Shane Taylor submitted those changes. We're very grateful to him for that. Maybe he's listening, who knows? He's far away, but he supports us with the documentation, and we appreciate that. In the developer reference, we've sort of consolidated some of the information around customization. And there's more to do here, but we recognize that one of the things that people customize most often is the PDF output. So we've provided a little bit of information about where the PDF transformation came from to help people understand why it works the way that it does. An overview of different approaches that people might consider for customizing PDF output, and why we think some of those are the wrong way, and why we think other ways are the right way. Talked talk a little bit about the plugin structure. That's something that is not exactly intuitive to new users. For those of you that have been around the toolkit for a long time, these are tidbits of information that were previously contained in the old README files that Idiom provided when they submitted plugin. But we realized that having things in README files way down in the deep depths of folder directories probably didn't help, so we surfaced those a little bit. And then provided some links to some resources for customizing plugins, most notably, of course, Lee's book, which she'll maybe talk about in a few minutes, and yeah, some best practices. So a little bit of information also about how to migrate your customizations from previous toolkit releases. These are also things that are not entirely new bits of content. There were in previous release notes information about this, but when the old release notes went away, people couldn't find this, so we've consolidated them into a separate section. And in 2.4, we've got a few more things. So in the earlier releases, we were already generating topics for parameters, listings, and messages directly from the plugin source code. But we noticed at some point that the extension points weren't completely documented. So there were sometimes we would get issues about extension points that weren't mentioned anywhere in the documentation. And we realized this is an opportunity to automate this because all of this is already contained within the plugin source itself. Maybe not described in an eloquent way, but it's there. So we pulled it out and then used the conref push mechanism to extend those descriptions to make them a little bit more readable. So that's a whole new section in the docs for 2.4. There's a new topic called DITA features in the documentation, which just provides a quick overview, maybe 5 or 6 examples of the way that we use DITA features to do things, how we use conref push, how we use keys and things like that. So for people who are familiar with these features, probably nothing new there, but for many of you who are wondering, how can I use these DITA 1.3 features in my own docs, just a few links to examples there. So that may be helpful. And then, of course, a brief overview of some migration-related things for the 2.4 release itself. We will probably add more to that as more people actually migrate to 2.4 and tell us the things that they stumbled over. So progress report on last year's ideas. Migration topics I mentioned, parameters topics, generating the documentation for the extension points. We went through and used the XML mention domain for everything, and the automated builds. So what's next? We've been talking for a while about updating our sample build scripts. Some of those still refer to those old garage examples and things like that that make people laugh. So we do have some other things that we can use as more current examples, perhaps maybe even the scripts that we use to build the documentation itself. So we plan to integrate those. The CSS that we use is still a little bit sort of dated, and we can modernize that a bit as well. We've talked about perhaps flagging some of the new content in the documentation based on the version, and maybe putting some tutorials together in one section of the documentation. We don't want to tell people how to use DITA features because that's sort of beyond the scope of the toolkit documentation, but the things that are specific to the way the toolkit processes certain code, certain markup may be helpful to people. So, and one more thing that we're thinking about is just revisiting the top-level structure for the documentation. For years now, it's been sort of divided into a user guide and a developer guide and things like that. And we're questioning how useful that is, because if you're actually adjusting something in the way the toolkit works, you have to ask yourself, am I a user or am I a developer, before you know where to look for that topic. So we're thinking of doing away with that and using a more task-based approach about information on installing the toolkit and how to customize and things like that. Some of it's already there, but just making that top-level structure a little bit more intuitive. And then the idea of automated testing to make sure that we catch errors in our documentation before it goes live. We do a little bit of that, but we'd like to do more. So that's that. And then, of course, we are very welcome, very curious for your suggestions. So if you have something that you'd like to see in the documentation, there are multiple ways that you can contribute that. If you find a bug, something that's wrong, and you don't quite know how to fix it, please let us know nonetheless. You can create an issue on GitHub to do that. You might want to take a look at the open issues just to check whether someone else has already noticed this. And if you do know how to fix it, you can create a pull request. And George showed us that wonderful complex diagram that I didn't have time to create. But that's exactly the point. It is a kind of complex process that can be intimidating to people who are unfamiliar with Git. So like George said, too complicated, skip all that. If you just find something simple and would like to fix it, there's this edit this page link at the bottom. So what happens if you want to use that? George showed us the front end of that process. Let's look now at what happens on the other end. So this is the page, the way that it looked like before George did what he did. And my screen is being cut off a little bit. Sorry about that. Let's see if I can fix that. How about this? Is that better? That's a little better. OK. So we refresh that page, and with a little bit of luck, we will see George's new pull request in our queue. I know it's difficult to read this in the back, but don't worry. We're not going to look very closely at this screen. But we see now what George has submitted. There's GitHub tells us that this needs to be reviewed. Fortunately, the checks have passed, so nothing's broken there. I can click this link to see exactly what it is that George has changed. On my screen, I can see on the left the old and on the right the new, and I look at it, although the type is tiny, and say, yeah, I like that. That sounds good. I'll go back and review the changes. I'm going to approve this. That looks good to me. So the changes have now been approved. That means that this pull request is now ready and can be merged. So I'm going to press the big green button here to do that. And it's going to jump away from me. Here we go. I have to confirm. Oh, sorry. Nope, that's fine. So we're happy with that. And this pull request has now been merged. A little icon jumped up down at the bottom to tell me that something happened. That was probably Slack telling me that a pull request has been closed. So we're happy about that. And then we can go back to our browser. And what will happen next is Travis, our continuous integration system, will start building that. So that has turned yellow here. There's a build running in the background. And if we're lucky, Travis will be happy with this and actually build the docs fresh with this new code. I probably don't want to try and talk until this is finished and turns green. But when it has finished and turns green, we can then go back to the page that George changed where it said created. And when we refresh that, it will say creates. So that's as exciting as that gets. So you can all, press refresh on your browsers until this one-letter change happens. But it illustrates the process. So more complex changes are made in the same way. So that's it. So like George said, you have no excuse. Contribute. If you see something, a room full of technical writers that use this tool, let us know. Thanks.